Hey everyone, this is Chris Mooney, and today we're talking about the Great Designer Search 3, Challenge number 3. Thanks again for all of your support. You can find my other GDS videos in this playlist. Let's get straight into it. This week's challenge was about creating your own keyword. I was pretty excited for this challenge because a lot of the innovation in Magic sets come in the form of new keywords, and we hadn't really gotten a chance to make one yet, so I was pretty pumped. I felt like choosing your keyword was the most important part of this challenge, so this video is going to talk a lot more about my process and what got cut than on the individual cards and the feedback from the judges. At first glance, this might seem like the easiest challenge, and in many ways it was. We could basically make whatever we wanted. There weren't that many rules. What made this challenge tricky, at least for me, was the previous challenge. The judges were so unpredictable and divided last round that I think everybody was sort of on edge. It only takes one bad week to send you home, and I don't think anybody really felt safe after last round. I started by simply creating a ton of different keywords. Some were keywords I borrowed from previous sets I worked on, others were just stuff that I came up on the spot. I knew a lot of them weren't going to work for the challenge, but during brainstorming you just want to get everything out onto the page. This week I was really inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, which has a lot of incredibly simple mechanics that it uses to represent larger resonant concepts. And I felt like Magic could borrow some of that energy. After eliminating any of the mechanics that I felt required too much support or too much explanation or simply weren't robust enough to hold a set, I had 5 finalists. The first mechanic was Boost. Boost was a pretty simple mechanic that lets you tap creatures at the beginning of combat to give another creature a bonus. The concept was based on the fact that Magic does a really poor job of representing support roles on the battlefield, like archers or clerics or especially bards. We obviously have all of those things in Magic, except for bards, but they don't really act like we'd expect them to act, especially if we come from sort of a role-playing background. Archers and clerics in Magic are really just smaller or differently sized fighters that have a somewhat flavorful ability. But I wanted these creatures to really stay back off the front lines and just help others fight. This mechanic was fun, and it played fine, but it was cut for a few reasons. It played a lot like a worse Exalted, since you'd often just pile all of your boosts onto one creature. It made attack steps take a long time if you had a lot of boost creatures out, since you'd have to work through all the different combinations. Making the creatures appropriately sized got hard pretty fast. If they were too weak, you would only ever use them to boost, and then you would run into problems if you just drew all your boost cards. But if you made them too strong, then they'd always be attacking themselves, and they would only boost when you didn't have a good attack. And that really lost the flavor that I was going for. Lastly, I felt like the design space was wide, but not very deep. You can have Boost do a lot of different things, but it doesn't really interact with other effects in the game. So in order to make it interesting, you'd have to start having cards that care about boosting or being boosted, and then it just turned into spaghetti code. All in all, it was really flavorful, and it played pretty good, but I didn't think it was going to hold up after another 2 days of playtesting. The second mechanic was Focus. Focus was based on the idea of concentration spells. I really liked Ascend and the idea of a status that you could gain, and in this case you could lose it, because it was something with a wide sweeping effect, but it was very easy to track. It was just on or off, and that's it. Trying to stay focused by preventing yourself from taking too much damage in the same turn was a fun little minigame, and it was really flavorful, but it obviously had the problem of heavily encouraging defensive play and turtling. You would just kind of hold all your creatures back so that you didn't lose the focus. The other big issue was that, unlike Ascend, every card had you gain focus in a slightly different way, closer to energy, which meant that you couldn't just slap it on any card that you wanted to. In-game, you'd have to read each focus card individually again and again to clarify how it worked. There were definitely solutions to these problems, but in the end I decided to give up and spend time on other mechanics. Even if I got focus to work properly, it'd only end up being a very defensive variant of either energy or Ascend. Just like Boost, I think there's a ton of potential still there, but it just wasn't going to work out for this challenge. After I cut Boost and Focus, I felt like my 3 remaining keywords were all good enough to consider for my final submission, so I buckled down and I started seriously playtesting all 3. I was really starting to feel the time pressure here, as I was 2 full days into the challenge and I had still had 3 options to choose from. The first of the top 3 to get cut was Stash. Stash was a mechanic that gave each player a little pile of exiled cards. It was called your stash. And then whenever a creature you control dealt combat damage to an opponent, you would put a card from your stash into your hand. I really liked Stash because it was simple and it was elegant. Under the hood, it would require defining a new game turn, but we had done that before with stuff like, the Monarch, so I wasn't really too worried about that part. My favorite part of the mechanic was that everybody could naturally interact with it, since almost every magic deck in existence, especially in Limited, can deal combat damage with creatures. My major concern was design space. I was worried that Stash would get kind of boring, since it was basically a very slow, hoop-jumping version of card draw. But it was then that I stumbled on the idea of stashing cards from other zones than the library. Since all players had access to their own stash naturally, you could use it as a sort of soft bounce, or a soft discard, or a soft raise dead. So what happened to Stash? At the end of the day, our playtesting team just decided that it wasn't fun enough. Every game with Stash sort of seemed to play out in one of two ways. Either you got your evasive creature or you got enough attackers that you could just consistently draw cards every turn, or your opponent successfully locked you out, and then you just stare at each other because your opponent couldn't actually attack, or they would risk giving you a bunch of cards. This made it really hard to cost appropriately, because Stash 2 could either mean draw 2 cards, or it could mean literally nothing depending on the game state. Putting cards into your opponent's stash was interesting, and it encouraged them to attack, which was good, but that was supposed to be the twist on the mechanic, not the main focus. Personally, I think that Stash has a ton of space left, and it deserves more exploration, but at the time it seemed like it was the hardest one to pull off, so it had to go. So that left us with two mechanics. One you already know, which was Backstab. I basically go over the entirety of Backstab's backstory in my blurb, which you can read in the article, link in the description. Backstab started out pretty simple, and it stayed that way the whole time, basically. It was incredibly straightforward, which isn't my usual style, but it had tons of natural synergy with abilities that already exist in Magic, including a ton of evergreen keywords, which meant that it could definitely hold up for at least one set's worth of cards. I really enjoyed how Backstab played into multiple different strategies. You could sneak through with evasion, overwhelm with numbers, or just have creatures that weren't appealing to block. It might be a little less exciting at higher rarities, but usually the design space that you're worried about is the simple commons and uncommons, and Backstab was great for those. Now, the second mechanic is probably my favorite mechanic, which is Pair. Pair started out as a mechanic called Twin. Twin creatures would enter the battlefield, they would make a copy of themselves, and then if either of the two copies went away, the other one would disappear as well. This was a lot of fun, but it made board states impossible to figure out. You would have a ton of creatures, but they weren't really separate because they had to stay alive together. So it was really hard to figure out. Attacking and blocking and, removal spells could be huge blowouts. So I decided to drop the complicated part and just focus on the token copy part, and that's where Pair comes from. Since in this version of the mechanic, Pair was always an upside, I decided to make it an additional cost, just to open up more design space and more play decisions. I loved Pair because of how much interesting space there was to explore with the ability. You can play around with creatures that get better with a buddy, or creatures that have end of the battlefield effects, or a host of other things before you even get to the pair-specific interactions, like caring about whether or not you're a token, or looking for creatures with matching names. There just seemed to be endless things that you could do with it. So, at this point in testing, we reached what I called the Amonkhet conundrum. Amonkhet is a set that has two major mechanics, Embalm and Exert. One of these mechanics, Exert, makes use of basic Magic game knowledge and terminology. It could go into almost any set without causing a lot of problems. It doesn't require special treatment of any kind. Embalm, on the other hand, takes up a massive amount of the set's resources. Every creature with Embalm had a special matching token created with matching art, specifically to help with memory, and they even gave you little punch cards so you could get a little counter to put on your card to remember that it was a token. Technically, those punch-out cards also had Exert reminders, but Exert could have gone without the punch cards, but Embalm probably couldn't have. So just like Embalm, the biggest issue with Pair was memory. Every Pair creature made a token copy of itself, and they were all different from one another. This was fine as long as you had the real creature to set alongside it, that wasn't ever a problem, but in playtesting, if they ever had a choice, the playtesters would always choose to kill the real copy of the creature first, because, tokens are less resilient to bounce or exile or a couple other things. What that meant is that you would be left with a battlefield that had a lot of token copies laying around, but none of the originals. Of course, you could always use the dead creature as a reminder, but that got pretty confusing too. If you replaced the token with your real creature card, then what if something cared about if it was a token? Or what if something cared about your creature card being in your graveyard? Embalm was able to avoid this because you had to exile the creature card to make the token, but Pair obviously didn't have this option. We tried to create a bunch of different copy tokens with different arts to help you remember, but even then we'd get into situations where things became almost impossible to track. So if Pair was like Embalm, then Backstab was like Exert. It could easily be slotted into any Magic set with no fuss at all. Other than the small rules confusion, which I agree, I should have taken more into account. It was probably the most printable idea that I'd had in a while. So at this point, I was so in love with Pair that I thought of every possible solution to the problem. We could create custom tokens for every single Pair card with matching art, just like in Balm. But then we could also create a blank placeholder token where you could physically write the name of the creature you were copying, kind of like a double-faced checklist card. We could reduce the frequency of cards that interacted with your graveyard to allow for less awkwardness of setting your dead pairs aside. And we could make a punch card that had a bunch of matching symbols, and then you could, basically put one on the original and one on the token copy, and then you would always remember which ones lined up. So I went through all of these ideas, but the more that I tried to save Pair, the more I realized that it just wasn't going to work out. If you remember, at the end of my last video, I spoke specifically about how I wanted to appeal to Eric and Melissa this time around. These are the two judges that are always thinking about the practical applications of cards, and have consistently encouraged me to be less fiddly, less memory intensive, and just in general to think more realistically about my cards being played in the actual world. They wanted to see something that they could print without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. Well, Pair was all hoops. It could work, sure, but how hard would it be to convince the judges of that? I only had 250 words for my blurb. Was that really enough space to explain the whole thing? And even if it was, would they go for it? Even if I did sell them on all my ideas, even if they bought into everything, there's still a huge financial and logistic cost to doing all of my suggestions. Was Pair really a good enough mechanic to warrant all of that extra work? I thought it was, but every assumption I made last week was wrong. Maybe it was time to start being a little more responsible, or, as Mark Rosewater would put it, have a little more respect for the craft of design. Now, here's the thing. At the time of recording, Battle Bond spoilers are coming out. So now we know that WotC has the power to ensure two matching cards always show up together, which means that they probably also have the ability to make a card and its matching Pair token show up together. If I were to do this challenge again today, I think that Pair would be my choice hands down. But I had to work with what I had at the time, and way back in April, the smart choice was obvious. It was Backstab. I can't tell you how hard it was for me to make this choice. It took every ounce of willpower I had to give up on Pair. Without my playtesters, I probably would have relapsed back to Pair within 1 or 2 hours. But I knew in my heart that Backstab was going to be the right choice if I wanted to succeed at the challenge. And ultimately, it seems like I was right. Okay, so now we can talk about Backstab. First of all, the judges are right, and this should absolutely be a triggered ability. Not only does this reduce the blowout potential of mid-combat removal, which I am literally ashamed that we didn't catch in playtesting, but it also means that we can add words to help players understand that this triggers after blockers are declared, not before. We knew that this was the case, and we played it that way every time in playtesting, and all the cards were designed with this in mind. Unfortunately, it seems like the judges were a bit confused on a couple of my cards, which is a shame, but it further goes to show that this clearer, more informative reminder text could have helped a lot. We actually playtested tons of games with large number of Backstab creatures. Every single Backstab creature is either on or off on any given turn. So how it always played out was that the blocking player would figure out, could I block every creature? And if they couldn't, then they just knew that all the Backstabs were on. Gang Leader was definitely the worst offender on this, but we kind of thought that was okay because it was a mythic. Maybe we were wrong about that. We also found that tracking Backstab became pretty natural after just a few games playing with the mechanic. Our hope was that a limited environment with Backstab would, help players get the hang of things quickly, and thus reduce confusion moving forward, similar to how players have to get the hang of more for Delirium, but once they do, it becomes sort of second nature. While it's true that Backstab is way more interesting when you have a Backstabber paired with another Flyer or another Death Toucher, rather than having them be on the same card, I didn't want to be afraid of making obvious designs. In the past, my instincts have always been to skip the cards that I felt anybody could make. But oftentimes, those were the cards that the judges liked the best. So, especially after last round, I felt like fighting my natural instinct might actually help me here. Even if I wrote all of these interactions into my blurb, there's no guarantee that the judges are going to keep that in mind as they're reading the cards. I thought it was simply safer to show the interaction directly on the card instead of trying to get fancy. Yeah, it's a bit obvious, but honestly, I just wasn't ready to take chances like that after the previous round. So I came into this week with essentially zero expectations. I felt decently about Backstab, but it was so outside my comfort zone that I couldn't really trust my instincts on it. And last challenge, my instincts were completely wrong, so all I could do was really cross my fingers. Luckily for me, my gambit played off pretty well. I ended up in second place this round. Eric and Melissa were totally on board and basically only suggested that one trigger change, which I completely agree with. Shout out to guest judge Jules Robbins. He also seemed to mostly enjoy my cards. His major issue was confusion, but I think we could answer most of those concerns just by switching to the triggered version of the ability with more informative reminder text. However, my plan might have worked out a little too well, because Mark Rosewater just absolutely hated me this week. I appreciate his comments. I think that they're completely fair. We did actually do quite a lot of playtesting, and we never felt like it got to the point where it was overwhelming, but obviously, by that point we had become experts in playing with backstab. It's very likely that we got tunnel visioned, and we couldn't see how complicated it actually was to a new player. My hope would just be to sit down with Mark, play a couple games with the cards, and figure out where it lands. It's clear that Mark was disappointed in everybody this round, but ultimately I think that that was a direct result of the last challenge. Remember that we get the judgings and the challenge at exactly the same time, just like you guys. That meant that everybody had just received comments that were all over the board. They didn't know what to think, and they immediately went into designing for this challenge. So I think that that heavily affected everybody's mental state. Nobody really wanted to stick their neck out when they were still so shell-shocked from the judgings of the previous round. That said, I felt like my, relative success this round gave me a very clear path moving forward. I knew what each of the 3 judges were after, and I just needed to find a balance between all of them. And that's exactly what Mark told me to do in my summary. Looking ahead, the next challenge had a focus on card concepts, which again was something that I felt was one of my major strengths. This next challenge had more rules and more conditions than any of the ones that we had had so far. So it was pretty intense. It came down to the wire. I definitely had a bad habit of, I would basically always submit my cards right at the last second. Like, we're talking 11:45, 11:50. Part of that was because my playtesters were available Sunday evening, so that was pretty harrowing. But another part was that I was just never finished. I always had to try and squeeze in those last few minutes of edits and changes, of making everything as good as it could possibly be in the time that I had. So, lessons for this week. Lesson number 1, just have your priorities straight. I shouldn't have put making digital easier in front of making the ability easier to play with and easier to understand. Lesson number 2, sometimes it pays off to play it safe. Backstab is a little boring, I understand that, but sometimes Magic needs boring keywords that play well, and I think that backstab is one of those. And lesson number 3 is that sometimes what seems simple to one person can be complex to another. When I created backstab, in my mind, it was so straightforward that I didn't think twice about the places where it was complicated. And rather than moving away from those to make it easier for everyone to play with, I decided to play up those complicated parts in my designs. I could have chosen abilities that didn't require specific rules knowledge to take advantage of the mechanic, and that would have helped me gain the confidence of judges like Mark Rosewater, who were already concerned about the mechanic before it even got to that complicated point. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I really appreciate all of your support. It was pretty daunting during the challenges themselves to not be able to talk to anybody or hear what anyone else was thinking. So I really appreciate it a ton to hear all of your support now, especially putting in all of that work for a couple months. To see it all pay off now, it is an awesome feeling. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. You can find me on Twitter, and I'll see you next week.